The letter arrived just as I was settling into an evening of quiet reflection. It bore no signature or seal, only an address scrawled in an unsteady hand. As I read, my curiosity was piqued. The letter spoke of strange happenings at Pendleton Mansion, a decaying relic on the outskirts of London. It implored the renowned Mr. Sherlock Holmes to uncover the truth behind the ghostly lantern that flickered in its windows at midnight. The handwriting betrayed desperation, the words trembling with fear. "They say it's cursed," Holmes murmured, holding the parchment to the lamplight. "Yet fear, Watson, is often a veil for mischief." He folded the letter neatly and placed it in his pocket. Despite my protests about the lateness of the hour, Holmes's curiosity was already afire. "A phantom lantern, Watson. Surely even you must admit it merits our attention." I acquiesced, though my skepticism remained steadfast. As we readied ourselves to depart, a chill breeze swept through the city streets. The cab ride to Pendleton Mansion was a silent one, save for the rhythmic clatter of wheels. The looming structure greeted us with an air of foreboding, its windows dark save for the faintest flicker within. The mansion stood like a spectral sentinel against the midnight sky, its crumbling walls etched with time's relentless hand. As we approached, Holmes raised a hand to halt me. "Look there, Watson," he whispered, pointing to an upstairs window. A faint, otherworldly glow emanated from within, flickering as though the lantern itself were alive. The light danced and swayed, casting long, wavering shadows upon the overgrown grounds. "Curious," Holmes remarked, his sharp eyes narrowing. We crept toward the front door, its rotting wood adorned with the remnants of grandeur. Holmes tested the handle. It yielded with a groan. Inside, the air was heavy, a mix of damp rot and an indefinable sense of dread. The faint glow still beckoned from above. The staircase creaked under our weight, each step a hesitant venture into the unknown. At the landing, we paused. The glow was brighter now, emanating from a room at the far end of the hall. Holmes gestured for silence as we approached. Suddenly, the light vanished. The room, when we entered, was empty, save for a thick layer of dust undisturbed by human presence. Holmes's eyes darted about, taking in every detail. "This, Watson," he declared softly, "is no mere haunting." I could not suppress my disbelief. "A trick of the light, Holmes," I suggested. "Perhaps a reflection, or even the mischief of a local prankster." Holmes, however, was undeterred. "Watson, you know as well as I that the simplest explanation is often the correct one. But in this case, simplicity eludes us." His gaze lingered on the floor, where a faint indentation marred the otherwise untouched dust. He knelt, running a gloved hand along the faint mark. The lantern may have vanished, but its bearer left traces. The game is afoot. Though I harbored doubts, Holmes's determination was infectious. Together, we resolved to delve deeper into the mystery of Pendleton Mansion, where every shadow seemed to whisper secrets and every creak of the floorboards hinted at unseen eyes watching our every move. The air within Pendleton Mansion was damp and unwelcoming, thick with the scent of decay and neglect. As we stepped into the grand yet crumbling foyer, the faint glow of the lantern beckoned us deeper into the shadowy depths of the house. "Curious," Holmes murmured, his gaze darting to the heavy drapes that swayed slightly, though no breeze stirred. "An abandoned house, yet it seems unwilling to be forgotten." Our footsteps echoed on the warped wooden floor, a mournful sound that seemed to resonate throughout the vast emptiness. The glow ahead shifted, almost as if it had a will of its own. I felt a chill creep along my spine, but Holmes strode forward with steady determination, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "Do you hear it, Watson?" he asked suddenly, pausing mid-step. I strained my ears and caught it, a faint creaking sound, distant but deliberate, like footsteps retreating into the shadows. "Perhaps the floorboards settling?" I suggested, though my voice betrayed my unease. Holmes only smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. Or perhaps something, or someone, wishing to remain unseen. Let us proceed. The glow grew brighter as we approached a narrow hallway, its oppressive silence broken only by the rhythmic patter of water dripping somewhere unseen. At the end of the hallway, a large, dust-covered canvas hung crookedly on the wall. Holmes approached it with careful deliberation, brushing away the grime with his handkerchief to reveal the faded faces of the Pendleton family. There were 5 figures in total, each bearing a peculiar mixture of austerity and unease. Lord Edmund Pendleton stood at the center, his stern visage framed by a high-collared coat, his piercing eyes betraying a shadow of turmoil. Holmes's gaze lingered on the smallest figure, a young boy who stood apart from the others. "Note the child's expression, Watson," he said, his voice low. "There is a sadness there, a distance, as though he does not belong." "What do you make of it?" I asked, uneasy under the painted stairs. "Families often conceal their darkest secrets beneath the veneer of propriety," Holmes replied cryptically. "This portrait may hold more truths than it was ever intended to reveal." In a room adjacent to the hall, we stumbled upon a small writing desk, its surface littered with forgotten papers. Holmes, ever meticulous, sifted through the debris until his fingers alighted on a worn leather journal. He opened it, revealing pages filled with spidery handwriting. "A personal account," he muttered, scanning the entries. His eyes sharpened as he read aloud. "The lantern must remain lit. Only the light can keep the shadows at bay. They whisper to me, demanding what I cannot give." "What does it mean?" I asked, leaning closer. Holmes turned the page, revealing a crude drawing of the lantern itself, surrounded by incomprehensible symbols. "This is no ordinary journal, Watson. These entries suggest a man driven to desperation, perhaps even madness. Yet they also hint at a greater mystery, one tied to the very object we seek." He closed the journal with a snap, his expression resolute. "The lantern is more than a mere artifact. It is a key. The question is, to what does it unlock?" As we continued our exploration, the echoes of whispered rumors began to take shape in my mind. The locals had long spoken of Lord Edmund Pendleton's tragic end, how he was found lifeless in the very room where the lantern now glowed. "Superstition runs deep here," Holmes remarked as we ascended a staircase that groaned beneath our weight. "The villagers speak of a curse, but such tales often conceal the truth." "And what truth do you suspect?" I asked, though a part of me feared the answer. "Truths born of human folly and greed," Holmes replied. "Yet beneath the surface lies something deeper, something dangerous." The mansion seemed to hum with the weight of its history, and as we reached the upper floor, I felt the walls themselves closing in, as though they held secrets too terrible to be told. The morning sun cast a pale glow over the quiet village as Holmes and I visited the local archives. The clerk, a hunched man with a thin smile, hesitated when we inquired about Pendleton Mansion's history, but eventually produced a bundle of faded documents. "The house has always been an ill omen," he murmured, his voice low as though fearing eavesdroppers. "Old Lord Pendleton was said to dabble in unnatural things." Holmes ignored the superstition, spreading the documents before him. His sharp gaze flitted across records of land deeds, personal letters, and newspaper clippings. "Here," he said, pointing to a yellowed article. "Mansion of Shadows, the scandal of Lord Pendleton. It claims he hosted secret gatherings of a peculiar nature." "Superstitious gossip," I remarked, though the article's lurid details unsettled me. Holmes smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but even gossip carries a kernel of truth." From there, we sought out an elderly villager, Mrs. Aldridge, who recounted tales of strange lights and midnight visitors to the mansion. "They said he summoned spirits," she whispered. "But after his death, the lights stopped. Until recently." Holmes straightened, his eyes gleaming with intrigue. "The lights returned when someone had need of them. Come, Watson, we have more to uncover." Back at the mansion, the oppressive silence seemed heavier, as though the house resented our intrusion. Holmes's keen eyes scanned every corner as he paced through the drawing room. "There is something amiss here," he muttered, tapping the walls methodically with his cane. "An anomaly in the architecture, Watson. Observe the uneven paneling here." I watched as he pressed against a section of the wall, revealing a concealed latch. With a creak that echoed ominously, a hidden door swung inward, revealing a dark staircase descending into the earth. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "No draft, yet the incense lingers." The air was thick with a cloying sweetness, faintly acrid, as we descended into the hidden chamber. The flickering light of our lantern revealed an unsettling tableau. An altar-like structure adorned with melted candles, fragments of paper covered in scrawled symbols, and a shallow bowl blackened by fire. "It seems Lord Pendleton left more behind than mere tales of eccentricity," Holmes remarked, his voice low. I shivered involuntarily. "Holmes, this feels unholy." "Nonsense, Watson," he replied briskly, though his gaze was sharp with intensity. "This is no altar to the supernatural. It is a stage for a deception." The chamber's walls were lined with intricate carvings, symbols etched deep into the stone. Holmes crouched beside one, tracing its outline with a gloved finger. "These are not random marks," he said. "Note the precision, the repetition. This symbol here resembles a sigil often linked to occult practices." "Occult practices? Surely you don't believe Pendleton engaged in such rituals?" I asked, my voice betraying my unease. "Not in the sense the villagers claim," Holmes replied. "But he was a man of ambition, and ambition often seeks the guise of mystique. These symbols are not arcane. They are deliberate, designed to instill fear and obedience." I examined another section of the wall, noting scratches beneath the carvings. Could these marks suggest a struggle? Possibly, Holmes mused. Or they could be the handiwork of a desperate soul attempting to uncover the truth behind the facade. The room seemed to press in on us, the oppressive air heavy with the weight of unspoken stories. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he examined the altar once more. "Each mark, each placement. It serves a purpose, Watson. Pendleton sought to control perception, and whoever reignited this charade is continuing his work." Holmes's attention shifted to the lantern resting on the altar. Unlike the rest of the room, it was spotless, its brass surface gleaming faintly. He examined it with care, dismantling its base with deft fingers. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Look here, Watson. A mirror fixed within the casing. This is no ordinary lantern. It's a device designed to reflect light in a specific direction." I leaned closer, puzzled. "To what end?" "Signals, my dear Watson," Holmes replied. "This lantern served as a beacon, communicating with someone at a distance. Note the adjustments here, calibrated for precise intervals. The question is, to whom was this signal intended, and why?" He gestured to the symbols surrounding the altar. "These markings create an air of mysticism, masking a more practical purpose. It is a clever deception, one meant to discourage interference." A sudden sound, a faint shuffle, broke the silence. We both turned sharply, but the chamber was empty. Holmes stood, his expression resolute. "This lantern is the key to unraveling the mansion's secrets, Watson. But it is not the light we must fear. It is the shadows that surround it." The scent of aged parchment hung in the air as Holmes carefully examined the ledger they had procured from a dusty archive in the local church. His sharp gaze flitted over the faded ink, landing on a single name scrawled repeatedly across the pages. Alaric Vane. "Here is our occultist," Holmes murmured, his tone as sharp as the edge of a blade. "A man shrouded in whispers and shadow. It appears he was both revered and reviled in equal measure." Watson leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "What could drive a man to such lengths? These rituals, were they meant to summon something or to keep it at bay?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He tapped a slender finger on a passage detailing gatherings beneath the house where lanterns were said to burn with unholy light. The lantern was a tool, Watson, not for illumination, but for manipulation. Vane orchestrated an illusion of power, ensnaring those desperate enough to believe his promises. Watson shuddered at the thought. Holmes, undeterred, closed the ledger with a decisive snap. Let us not linger in speculation. The truth lies in the depths of this house. Descending once more into the mansion's oppressive silence, Watson found his unease mounting with every step. The revelations about Alaric Vane clung to his mind like an unwelcome shadow, and the flicker of the lantern in Holmes's hand seemed to mock his doubts. "Holmes," Watson began hesitantly, "do you not think we tread dangerously close to matters best left undisturbed? The occult, the rituals, this is not a case of mere human folly." Holmes paused mid-stride, turning to regard his companion with an intensity that froze Watson in place. "Danger, my dear Watson, is but the veil behind which truth often hides. Would you have us abandon the pursuit simply because it unsettles the soul?" Watson faltered, his voice quieter now. "But what if the truth itself is the peril? There are stories of men who delved too deep, Holmes, and returned victorious, armed with knowledge," Holmes interjected, his tone resolute. "Fear has its place, Watson, but it shall not dictate my steps. Come, the game is afoot." In the hidden chamber, the air grew heavier as Holmes's deductions unfurled like threads of a sinister tapestry. By the light of the lantern, he traced the symbols etched into the stone walls, his voice low but charged with urgency. "Vane was no mere dabbler," he said. "These markings form a sequence, an invocation. He sought to channel forces beyond mortal comprehension. But note the disruptions here and here." Holmes gestured to areas where the carvings were marred, as though deliberately defaced. Evidence of an abrupt end. Someone sought to undo his work. Watson felt a chill creep up his spine. But why? To stop him, or to exact vengeance? Holmes straightened, his keen gaze narrowing. Perhaps both. Vane's downfall was inevitable, a convergence of arrogance and folly. Yet his legacy persisted, bound to this lantern. It served as both beacon and warning, a lure for those who dared follow in his footsteps. The room seemed to close in around them, the faint scent of incense mingling with the weight of unearthed secrets. Watson, gripping his revolver tightly, whispered, "Do you believe we are alone in this house, Holmes?" Holmes's answer came without hesitation, his voice a calm counterpoint to the growing tension. "We are never truly alone, Watson. Not when history clings to the present as it does here. Prepare yourself. The darkest revelations are yet to come." The faint rustle of parchment broke the stillness of the dimly lit archives as Holmes and I delved into records thick with dust and age. The air carried the faint metallic tang of ink, mingled with the earthy scent of time-worn pages. Holmes's keen eyes scanned the documents with relentless precision, his fingers tracing lines of forgotten history. "Watson," he began, his voice a murmur that barely disturbed the quiet, "observe this ledger from the mid-19th century. It details a series of extravagant purchases by the Pendleton family, properties, artifacts, and estates that far exceeded their known means of wealth." I leaned closer, noting the abrupt rise in their fortune that coincided with cryptic notations in the margins. "Do you think these transactions were connected to their supposed pact?" Holmes tapped the page thoughtfully. "There is a pattern here, Watson. Wealth amassed without apparent labor, coinciding with local murmurs of strange gatherings at their estate. Our investigation unearthed further peculiarities, mentions of a lordly heir, Edmund Pendleton, whose name abruptly ceased to appear in the records after a certain date." Holmes closed the final ledger with an air of grim satisfaction. "We are piecing together a tale, Watson. Let us hear it in full from a source more acquainted with its telling." The historian's study was a haven of antiquity, filled with bookshelves that groaned under the weight of neglected lore. The man himself, a slight and spectacled figure, greeted us with a mixture of eagerness and apprehension. "You've come about the Pendleton curse, I presume?" he ventured, his voice tremulous but resolute. Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, sir. Spare no detail, if you please." The historian adjusted his spectacles and began his tale. The Pendleton family's rise to affluence was meteoric. Unnatural, many whispered. It was said that Augustus Pendleton, patriarch of the family, sought power beyond mortal means. He entered into a pact with, well, let us call them dark forces. In exchange, he was granted unparalleled wealth and influence. The man paused, as though weighing the gravity of his words. But such bargains are never free. A price was demanded, a blood price. The lantern, an object steeped in mysticism, was a symbol of that unholy accord. It would light only on nights of tragedy, heralding calamity for those bound by the pact. Watson, visibly perturbed, glanced at Holmes, who remained inscrutable. "And what of the family?" Holmes inquired. "Destroyed by their ambition," the historian replied, his tone mournful. "The wealth they so desperately sought brought ruin instead. Their name is now synonymous with despair." The historian leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The lantern's appearance is no mere spectral phenomenon. It is a signal, a reminder of the Pendletons' pact. Its glow marks the resurgence of the curse, coinciding with the anniversary of Lord Edmund Pendleton's disappearance." Holmes interjected, his tone sharp. "You imply the lantern is more than a portent. It serves a purpose beyond mere superstition." "Precisely," the historian confirmed, his expression grim. "The lantern is a key of sorts. It is believed to reveal the location of an ancient treasure hidden within the mansion, a treasure that holds the power to break the curse, should it be recovered." I could not suppress a shudder. "And if the treasure remains undiscovered?" "Then the curse persists," the historian replied, his voice heavy with foreboding. "Each generation of Pendletons was haunted by this legacy. Those who tried to escape it met untimely ends, and those who embraced it were consumed by their greed." Holmes, his eyes alight with intensity, stood abruptly. "You have given us much to consider. Come, Watson, the lantern's glow awaits our understanding." As we departed the historian's study, his final words lingered like an unwelcome echo. The story of Lord Edmund Pendleton's disappearance came to life in my mind, vivid and unsettling. Edmund was the youngest heir of the Pendleton line, the historian had recounted. A man of charm and ambition, yet plagued by a peculiar obsession with the occult. On the night of his 25th birthday, a night said to mark the apex of the family's pact, he vanished without a trace. Witnesses claimed the lantern burned brighter than ever before, its glow visible from miles away. Holmes, reflecting on the account, spoke with measured deliberation. "Consider, Watson, that Edmund may not have vanished at all. His absence aligns too conveniently with the disruptions in the family's records. There is something deliberately concealed here." "But to what end?" I pressed. Holmes's lips curved into a rare, enigmatic smile. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we shall uncover. Edmund Pendleton's story is the key to unraveling this entire affair." The weight of our task settled upon us as we returned to the mansion, the lantern's eerie glow beckoning us toward its secrets. The scent of ancient parchment and the faint rustle of paper created an ambiance of foreboding in the historian's study. Holmes, seated upright with an air of determination, tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair. "Watson," he began, his tone deliberate, "the threads of this mystery are weaving into a chilling tapestry." The historian leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The lantern's appearance coincides with the tragic anniversary of Lord Edmund Pendleton's death, a night when the Pendleton curse is said to awaken." Holmes's eyes gleamed as he leaned back. A mere coincidence? I think not. This lantern serves not merely as a harbinger but as a signal. It is a guide, pointing to a danger concealed within the mansion, a danger tied to the treasure itself. Watson's brow furrowed. A treasure, you say? Surely you don't suggest that material wealth could hold such sway over fate? Not wealth, my dear Watson, Holmes corrected sharply, but power, that which was sought through unholy means. The curse and the lantern's spectral glow mark its presence, as if the mansion itself conspires to conceal and protect its dark secrets. The historian shuddered, his voice trembling. Those who dare to pursue the treasure are said to suffer grievous fates. The Pendleton family's pact must have tethered their fortune to a force that demands its price, a price that Edmund paid. Holmes stood abruptly, his expression set. Then we must pay a visit to the heart of this enigma. The lantern does not merely herald doom. It reveals the path. The treasure must be unearthed before it claims another victim. The treasure lies within the mansion, the historian affirmed, his trembling hands grasping an old leather-bound tome. But it is no ordinary hoard of gold or jewels. Legend speaks of an artifact, a relic imbued with the essence of the Pendleton Pact. It is both the key to their prosperity and the anchor of their curse. Holmes's voice was sharp. If this artifact exists, its removal could sever the grip of this malevolence. The curse, I suspect, is bound not only to the family, but to this object. Watson interjected, concern etched into his face. But Holmes, what of the risks? Surely tampering with such a thing could unleash further calamity. Precisely why it must be handled with the utmost precision, Holmes replied. We are not dealing with mere superstition. The lantern is the clue. The treasure is the solution. We have no choice but to act swiftly. The historian nodded solemnly. The relic's location remains hidden, but the lantern's light has been said to guide the way on the fateful night. Its path is dangerous, marked by symbols and traps intended to protect the treasure from those unworthy. Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile. Then we shall prove ourselves worthy, Watson. The clock ticks against us, and the curse looms ever closer. Night crept upon the village like a shadowy specter, casting long fingers of gloom over the streets. Holmes and Watson, invigorated by their findings, strode briskly back toward the Pendleton mansion. The air was thick with the promise of rain, and a low rumble of thunder echoed ominously in the distance. Holmes's voice cut through the silence. Watson, observe the urgency of this matter. The lantern's reappearance signals not only the curse's revival, but also the narrowing of our window to act. Watson nodded, gripping his cane tightly. And should we fail, Holmes? What then? Failure, Holmes said coldly, is a luxury we cannot afford. The treasure must be located and retrieved before the lantern's next manifestation. Every piece of this puzzle aligns with precision. Lord Edmund's disappearance, the family's ruin, and the sinister pact. All converge upon this artifact. As they neared the mansion, a chill wind stirred the leaves, whispering secrets from ages past. Holmes halted abruptly and turned to Watson. We must proceed methodically. If my deductions hold true, the lantern's glow will reveal the path within the mansion. Be prepared for anything, Watson. The curse does not yield lightly. Watson's voice was firm despite the unease flickering in his eyes. By your side, Holmes, through whatever awaits. Holmes inclined his head. Time is our greatest adversary now. The fateful anniversary approaches. Let us ensure that when the lantern glows again, it guides us to resolution, not ruin. The room was a tableau of tension as Holmes and I entered the Pendleton family's drawing room, where 3 surviving members awaited our inquiry. Holmes's sharp gaze swept across them, lingering briefly on each face as though cataloging their secrets. Lady Margaret, the eldest and matriarch of the family, clutched a handkerchief with trembling hands. "I warned Edmund," she began, her voice wavering, "that his pursuits would lead to ruin. He was always different." Holmes leaned forward. "Different, Lady Margaret? In what way?" "He grew restless," she replied, her voice thick with grief. "He spoke of voices in the night, of dreams that called him to the family crypt. He became obsessed with our history, claiming it held answers to his torment." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And what did you make of these claims?" Lady Margaret hesitated, her eyes darting toward Archibald Pendleton, Edmund's younger brother. "I dismissed them as folly," she admitted. Archibald scoffed, his tone dripping with disdain. "Folly, indeed. Edmund was a fool chasing shadows. He spent days poring over musty tomes and scrawling nonsense on parchment. It was as if he were possessed." Holmes's gaze sharpened as he turned to the third figure, a cousin named Eleanor. "And you, Miss Pendleton. What did you observe?" Eleanor's voice was soft but firm. "Edmund spoke of uncovering a great truth, something that would restore the Pendleton name to glory. He believed he was on the verge of a revelation." Holmes straightened. "A revelation, you say? Fascinating." The family library was a trove of knowledge and the stage for Edmund's descent into darkness. As Holmes examined the contents of Edmund's private study, the evidence of his fixation became starkly clear. Watson frowned as he held up a tattered volume. "The Arcane Mysteries of the Ancients," he read aloud. "This is no light reading." "Indeed, Watson," Holmes replied. "These texts suggest a mind consumed by esoteric lore. Look here, marginal notes in Edmund's hand. He was charting symbols, attempting to decode something." The housekeeper, Mrs. Grayson, shuffled in hesitantly. "Begging your pardon, sirs, but Lord Edmund often burned candles at all hours of the night." He muttered to himself, spoke of rituals. It frightened the staff. Holmes nodded. "Did he ever confide in you about his findings, Mrs. Grayson?" "Not directly," she admitted, "but I once overheard him speaking of a lantern, a key to unlocking the Pendleton legacy. He believed it was tied to the curse." Watson exhaled heavily. "A lantern, again. It seems to be at the heart of this mystery." Holmes tapped his chin, his expression thoughtful. "A man does not unravel like this without cause. There is more to his obsession than mere curiosity. What drove him to the occult, and why now?" Holmes stood by the window, gazing into the distance as though the answers lay beyond the fog-laden moors. "Watson," he began, "this is no mere tale of a man lost to madness. There are threads of deliberate malice here." Watson furrowed his brow. "You believe someone pushed Edmund toward this fate?" "Not quite," Holmes replied. "But consider the timing. His sudden obsession, his disappearance just as he claimed to have made a discovery. What if Edmund's unraveling was orchestrated, designed to render him vulnerable?" Watson hesitated. "But who would benefit from such a scheme?" Holmes turned sharply. "Follow the money, Watson." The Pendleton fortune was within Edmund's grasp, yet his disappearance shifts the inheritance to another. "Archibald," Watson murmured, realization dawning. "Precisely," Holmes said. "And if Edmund had indeed discovered the location of the family treasure, his removal would serve a dual purpose, silencing him and keeping the treasure hidden." Watson's expression darkened. "You suspect Archibald." Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile. "I suspect many things, my dear Watson. But one thing is certain. This was no accident. The threads of conspiracy tighten with each revelation." Archibald Pendleton's study was a stark contrast to his brother's, a room of order and practicality, devoid of sentiment. Holmes's penetrating gaze fixed upon Archibald as he questioned him. "Your brother's sudden fascination with the occult," Holmes began, "must have been troubling for the family?" Archibald leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral. "Troubling, yes, but hardly surprising. Edmund was always chasing some grand illusion. Holmes's eyes glinted. And yet, his disappearance left you as the primary heir to the estate. A fortuitous turn of events, wouldn't you say? Archibald's jaw tightened. Are you implying I had something to do with Edmund's folly? Implying? Holmes said lightly, Number merely observing. Tell me, did you ever receive correspondence from your brother before his disappearance? Archibald hesitated, then gestured to a locked drawer. There was a letter. I dismissed it as ramblings. Holmes retrieved the letter, his movements precise. He read aloud. Archibald, I have found it. The treasure that will change everything. Meet me at midnight in the crypt, and I will show you the truth. The room fell silent as Holmes folded the letter. It seems your brother trusted you deeply. Tell me, Mr. Pendleton, did you honor his request? Archibald's face paled. I never went. Holmes's expression grew severe. Then the question remains, who else knew of his discovery, and who sought to silence him? The room fell silent save for the delicate rustle of paper as Holmes carefully unfolded the brittle parchment. The letter, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Edmund's study, bore the unmistakable scrawl of the vanished lord's handwriting. Watson, leaning forward with bated breath, watched as Holmes's sharp eyes darted across the text. Ah, Holmes murmured, his voice tinged with satisfaction. A confession of sorts, though not the one we might expect. What does it say? Watson inquired, unable to suppress his curiosity. Holmes began to read aloud. Archibald, my brother, fortune smiles upon us at last. I have discovered what our ancestors sought for centuries. A map, hidden within the folds of our great-grandfather's journal, pointing to the Pendleton treasure. This secret could restore our family's glory, but it must remain between us until it is secure. Trust no one. Watson's brow furrowed. A treasure, but why conceal such a discovery? Holmes folded the letter with care. To proclaim such a find would invite predators, Watson. And yet the secrecy itself may have invited peril. This letter changes everything. It offers both motive and opportunity, two cornerstones of crime. He placed the letter into his coat pocket, his expression inscrutable. We now know Edmund's disappearance is no mere flight of fancy, but a calculated act of desperation or greed. The question is, whose desperation and whose greed? Watson felt a chill, sensing the depth of the intrigue. What is our next step, Holmes? The answer lies with Archibald, Holmes replied, rising with purpose. Holmes and Watson convened in their lodgings, the gravity of the case settling over them like a heavy fog. Holmes, pacing with a deliberate rhythm, began to voice his thoughts. Consider the implications, Watson. Archibald, the younger brother, once stood as heir to the Pendleton estate. That is, until Edmund's untimely elevation. Would not resentment take root in such fertile soil? Watson nodded. But resentment alone does not account for the disappearance. Indeed, Holmes replied, his tone sharp, resentment is but a seed. Greed and opportunity nourish it. If Archibald knew of the treasure, his brother's discovery would have been a double-edged sword, a chance to claim the family fortune and remove an inconvenient rival. But would he go so far as to... Watson hesitated. Holmes interjected, his voice edged with steel. Murder? That remains to be seen. However, the letter implies an intimate knowledge shared between the brothers. Archibald could have intercepted Edmund, either coercing or silencing him. The lack of a body does not absolve guilt, it complicates it. Watson shuddered. And if your theory proves true, then justice demands action, Holmes said, his eyes narrowing. And Archibald Pendleton must answer for his intentions. Holmes's eyes glittered with resolve as he laid out their plan. Watson, we must tread carefully. Archibald is no fool, and the mere mention of this letter could provoke him to rash action. And yet, we must confront him, Watson pressed. What is our course?" Holmes gestured toward a map of the Pendleton estate spread across the table. "First, we investigate Edmund's claim. If the treasure is real and Archibald is aware of its location, we may catch him in the act." The duo set out for the estate under the cover of dusk, their presence concealed by the shadowed halls. Holmes led Watson to a forgotten wing of the manor, where Edmund's journal had hinted at a hidden chamber. The air was thick with dampness, the scent of decay mingling with centuries-old dust. "Here," Holmes whispered, pointing to an uneven section of the wall. With a deft hand, he uncovered a concealed lever. A low rumble followed, revealing a passage. Watson's pulse quickened. "And what if Archibald finds us first?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Then we shall improvise. But our priority is evidence, Watson. Let the guilty condemn themselves with their actions." As they ventured deeper, the weight of the case bore heavily upon them. Watson glanced at Holmes, whose calm demeanor masked an undercurrent of intensity. "Prepare yourself," Holmes murmured. "This is where the truth will be laid bare, and where our quarry may seek to elude us one final time." Sherlock Holmes stood in our dimly lit sitting room, his sharp profile illuminated by the flicker of a single gas lamp. In his hands he held a curious device, an intricate snare crafted to trigger the moment it detected movement. "Watson," he began, his voice carrying the weight of precision and purpose, "tonight we unmask the specter that haunts Pendleton Manor." I watched as he methodically checked the snare, its metal components gleaming faintly. His confidence was infectious, though I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. The tales surrounding the lantern and its ghastly glow had unnerved even the most rational minds. Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "The culprit has relied on superstition to cloak their scheme. That shall end tonight. Our objective is twofold: to catch them in the act and to uncover the purpose behind this elaborate deception." I nodded, my revolver holstered but within easy reach. Holmes's plan was both daring and meticulous. We would return to the mansion at the hour of the lantern's supposed manifestation. With the snare in place and ourselves hidden, we would await its appearance. "Are you prepared for what may come, Watson?" he asked, his piercing gaze meeting mine. "As prepared as one can be under such circumstances," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Holmes smiled faintly, a rare display of camaraderie. "Good, then let us be off. Tonight the truth will rise, no matter how deeply it has been buried." The walk to Pendleton Manor was a journey steeped in foreboding. The air was damp, carrying the earthy scent of autumn decay, and the silence of the countryside was broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl. Beside me, Holmes moved with a purposeful stride, his silhouette blending into the night. "Do you truly believe the lantern will appear again?" I asked, my breath visible in the chill. "It must," Holmes replied. "If our adversary seeks to maintain their charade, they cannot afford to break the pattern now." As the manor loomed into view, its darkened windows like watchful eyes, a shiver ran down my spine. The once grand structure now stood as a monument to secrecy and dread. Holmes halted, his gaze fixed on the upper floor. "There," he murmured, pointing to a faint glimmer emanating from a distant window. "The game begins." We approached cautiously, our steps muffled by the damp ground. At the edge of the garden, Holmes gestured for me to stop. "Remember, Watson, silence and observation are our greatest allies tonight." I nodded, gripping my revolver tightly. Together, we entered the mansion, its ancient timbers groaning beneath our weight, and prepared for what lay ahead. The stillness of the mansion was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood. Holmes and I took our positions in the shadow of the grand staircase, our eyes trained on the source of the faint light that now flickered at the end of the hall. "There it is," I whispered, the words scarcely audible. The lantern's glow was spectral, casting distorted shadows on the walls as it swayed gently. It moved with an unnatural rhythm, as though carried by unseen hands. Holmes's expression remained calm, though his eyes betrayed his intense focus. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The sway is deliberate, designed to mimic something otherworldly. A clever ruse, but not clever enough." As the lantern drew closer, the faint outline of a figure emerged behind it. The person was cloaked, their face obscured, but their movements betrayed caution rather than ghostly malevolence. Holmes gestured for me to stay put, then began to inch forward with feline grace. The lantern suddenly stopped, its light bobbing slightly as if in hesitation. Holmes froze, his eyes narrowing. The figure turned abruptly, as if sensing our presence, and the lantern's glow intensified. Then, without warning, the figure bolted toward the back of the house. "Quickly, Watson!" Holmes called, his voice cutting through the silence. We gave chase, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls as the lantern's glow darted like a will-o'-the-wisp ahead of us, leading us deeper into the mansion's labyrinthine corridors. Our pursuit came to an abrupt halt in the east wing of the mansion, where the lantern's glow vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Holmes raised a hand, signaling for silence. The air felt heavy, charged with an almost tangible sense of foreboding. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I strained my ears and caught it, a faint scraping sound like metal against stone, emanating from the room ahead. Holmes moved swiftly, his footsteps silent on the worn floorboards. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. As we entered the room, the scene before us froze me in place. Archibald Pendleton lay sprawled on the floor, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Beside him, the extinguished lantern rested on its side, its glass cracked. A pool of blood seeped from a wound on his chest, staining the floorboards dark. Holmes crouched beside the body, his expression unreadable. "Foul play," he muttered. "This was no accident." My throat tightened. But if Archibald was the one behind the lantern, who— Holmes cut me off with a sharp gesture. "The treasure is gone, Watson, and so it seems is our true adversary. We are dealing with a far more cunning opponent than we anticipated." A cold dread settled over me as Holmes's words sank in. The game was far from over. The darkness of Pendleton Manor enveloped us as Holmes and I sprinted down its narrow, winding corridors. The lantern's glow ahead of us flickered and darted, like a beacon leading us deeper into the labyrinth of shadow. I could hear the rapid pounding of my own heart, but there was no time to focus on fear. The chase had begun, and every step we took brought us closer to the truth, or deeper into danger. Holmes moved with swift precision, his steps soundless as he anticipated every twist and turn. I struggled to match his pace, but the terror of the unknown pressed at my chest, urging me forward. The lantern bobbed ahead, its glow now erratic, as though the figure bearing it were in haste, or perhaps trying to outwit us. Then came the first trap. A hidden blade sprung from the wall, narrowly missing Holmes by inches as he twisted his body to avoid it. I barely dodged it myself, my heart racing with the near miss. Holmes paused only for a moment, his eyes gleaming with determination. "Keep your wits about you, Watson. They are counting on your hesitation." We pressed on, the narrow passageways twisting like the veins of the mansion itself, but Holmes's mind was already ahead, calculating the patterns. A hidden door suddenly swung open before us, leading into a long, dusty hallway. One I had not seen before. "This way, Watson," Holmes urged, darting inside. We plunged into the unknown, the lantern's light just ahead, the sound of our pursuers' hurried footsteps echoing in the distance. What awaited us in these forgotten corridors I could not say, but there was no turning back now. We rounded another corner and the lantern's flickering light suddenly stilled. Holmes held up a hand, signaling for silence. We were close, very close. Then, in the stillness of that darkened hallway, a voice, low, strained, and familiar, spoke from the shadows. "Do you really think you can uncover the truth, Holmes?" The voice was unmistakable. Archibald Pendleton. A figure stepped into view, their face half obscured by a mask. The lantern hung at their side, casting an eerie glow across the features I knew all too well. The figure's hands trembled as they gripped the handle of the lantern. But there was no mistaking it now. Archibald Pendleton, the man who had been orchestrating this entire charade. "You!" I gasped, unable to hide my shock. Holmes's face was inscrutable as he took a step forward. "It was always you, Pendleton. The curse, the lantern, all to protect your precious secret." Pendleton's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "You understand nothing, Holmes. This was never about a curse. It was about keeping what is rightfully mine." The truth was finally within reach, but before we could press further, the situation turned darker still. Before Holmes could respond, Pendleton suddenly turned and bolted down the hallway. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, but Holmes was already in motion, urging me to follow. We ran after him, the lantern's light wavering ahead, only to find it suddenly extinguished as we neared the grand stairwell. Then, as if the very air around us had frozen, we heard it. An unmistakable sound, a soft thud, followed by an eerie silence. Holmes skidded to a halt and motioned for me to be still. We crept forward, our breaths shallow and quick. There, on the floor of the drawing room, lay Pendleton's body. Cold, lifeless, a crimson stain spreading beneath him. The lantern was beside him, its glass shattered, but it was clear now. He had not been the one to flee. Something had gone terribly wrong. Holmes knelt beside the body, his brow furrowed in concentration. A wound to the chest, clean and precise. He did not die in the way one would expect from a fall. "But who?" I began, my voice trailing off as the realization struck. Holmes stood, his eyes narrowing. "The treasure is gone, Watson. The very thing he sought to protect. Someone else is involved. This is no longer merely a matter of a haunted lantern. It is the work of a far more calculating mind." I stared down at Pendleton's lifeless form, my mind racing with unanswered questions. The hunt was not over. In fact, it had only just begun. The death of Archibald Pendleton had cast a shadow of uncertainty over our investigation, but I could see the sharpness returning to Holmes's eyes. As we stood over the body, the weight of the case seemed to shift, the puzzle pieces now scattered in front of us. I had been certain that Archibald was the architect of the curse, but Holmes, ever the astute observer, was beginning to piece together a much deeper conspiracy. "Watson," Holmes began, his voice measured and calm, "Archibald was no more than a pawn in this game, a terrified, willing participant perhaps, but a pawn nonetheless." I raised an eyebrow, my mind struggling to keep pace with his thoughts. But the lantern, the traps, the curse. How could he not be involved? Holmes knelt beside Pendleton's body, his fingers brushing over the edges of the discarded lantern. "Indeed, but there is more to this than meets the eye. The curse, the traps, they were all designed to keep others at bay. But Archibald was only one piece of a much larger puzzle, Watson." I watched him as he examined the room, his gaze shifting from the broken lantern to the pages of the journal still clutched in my hand. The cryptic symbols and odd notes we had uncovered in Pendleton's study now took on new meaning. "The mastermind," Holmes continued, "is someone far more elusive than Archibald. Someone hidden in plain sight. We must look deeper, beyond the obvious." The pieces were falling into place, but the true nature of the puzzle remained frustratingly elusive. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he turned from the body of Archibald to the scattered pages of the journal I had retrieved earlier. His fingers traced the faded ink of the cryptic symbols with a quiet intensity. He looked up at me, his mind clearly racing. "Watson, I believe we have been searching in the wrong direction." He paced slowly, deep in thought. Archibald's involvement, though real, was a distraction. The true architect of this curse is someone much closer, someone of the Pendleton bloodline. I frowned, unable to follow the thread of his logic. A Pendleton relative? But who could it be? Archibald had no siblings. He was the last of his line. Holmes nodded. Ah, but there was one branch of the Pendleton family thought lost in both history and memory. A cousin, you see, who has lived in plain sight, biding their time, waiting for the moment to strike. Who? I asked, my voice betraying my growing urgency. Think, Watson. The family's records, the will, the cryptic passages in the journal. It all points to one person, the true mastermind behind the curse, a cousin long thought to have vanished, hiding under the guise of a trusted ally within the Pendleton estate. The name hung in the air like a forgotten whisper, and I could feel the truth dawning upon me. The person we seek is none other than Thaddeus Pendleton, a cousin by blood, but a stranger by choice. I took a step back, shocked by the revelation. Thaddeus Pendleton. How could we have missed him? Holmes's words lingered in my mind like an echo, and I found myself drawn back to the journal in my hand, now an even more crucial piece of the puzzle. I could see now that the faded symbols, once indecipherable, had a deeper meaning, a code that connected the Pendleton family's tragic history with the curse that had gripped the estate. As Holmes leaned over my shoulder, I began to read aloud. The bloodline's last hope lies within the hands of the lost one. I paused, feeling the weight of the words settle into the pit of my stomach. Thaddeus, Holmes whispered almost to himself. This line must refer to him, the lost one, the relative whom all assumed dead or disappeared. I nodded, my heart racing. But what does it mean? What hope could he hold? Holmes was already studying the next page, his brow furrowed in concentration. He ran his finger over a series of symbols that, in retrospect, now seemed obvious. These symbols here, Watson, they are not random. They are linked to an ancient ritual, a pact made long ago. The Pendleton family, they were not merely wealthy. They made bargains, dark bargains, and this artifact, the one Archibald sought to protect, is the key. I leaned in closer, the weight of the mystery pressing upon us both. What artifact? Holmes turned to me with a sharp, knowing look. The artifact that controls life and death, Watson. Thaddeus's bloodline may have been hidden from the world, but the power of this artifact has always belonged to the Pendleton family, and now they intend to use it to reshape their destiny. I felt the chilling truth settle in. The treasure was not gold. It was something far darker, far more dangerous. The realization came crashing down upon us with a sudden and chilling clarity. The treasure was not gold. It was an artifact, an ancient object, imbued with powers that reached far beyond the mortal realm. Holmes's eyes glinted with the sharp intensity I had come to recognize during our most dangerous investigations. The Pendleton family, he said, his voice low and filled with gravity, struck a pact with forces beyond our understanding. An artifact with the power to control life and death. A relic from an age where men dabbled in things better left untouched. I could hardly comprehend the weight of his words. Life and death? I asked, struggling to grasp the magnitude of what Holmes was implying. Holmes's gaze never wavered. Yes, Watson. This artifact holds the key to manipulating fate itself, the ability to raise the dead, to control the lives of others with but a thought, an unimaginable power. My mind reeled as Holmes continued to explain. Thaddeus Pendleton, hiding in plain sight, has sought this power for years. The curse, the lantern, the traps, were all designed to protect the artifact, to guard it against prying eyes. But now, with Archibald's death, Thaddeus believes the time has come. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized the depth of the danger we were facing. But how do we stop him? I asked, my voice tight with fear. Holmes's lips curled into a grim smile. We destroy the artifact, Watson. It is the only way to break the curse and end this nightmare once and for all. I felt a pang of dread. The battle was not just for the treasure. It was for the very souls of the Pendleton family, and perhaps our own. The damp, oppressive air hung heavy in the room as Holmes sat in his customary chair, brow furrowed, lips pursed in thought. Watson stood near the window, the dim light casting long shadows across his face. "We have all the pieces, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice sharp with clarity. Archibald, poor wretch that he was never the mastermind. He was merely a tool in a game far beyond him. The true orchestrator of this sinister plan is someone much closer to the Pendleton family than we ever suspected. Watson, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. "You mean a relative?" "Yes, precisely. A cousin, one who has lived in plain sight, hidden behind a veneer of respectability. The clues were there all along, Watson. The cryptic symbols in the journal were not just riddles, they were warnings, signs that only a Pendleton would understand. And that, my dear friend, is what gives him away." As Holmes paced the room, his mind working at a pace that left Watson struggling to keep up, he continued, "I suspect that this cousin, driven by an insatiable hunger for power, discovered the artifact's true potential long ago. He has been using it for years, manipulating the family from the shadows, all while posing as one of their own." "Where do we find him, then?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with urgency. Holmes turned toward Watson, his eyes alight with certainty. "The mansion, Watson. The symbols lead us there. They point to a secret chamber within the walls, a hidden room where the artifact resides, and where this villain will make his final stand." As they gathered their coats and prepared for the perilous confrontation, Watson felt a sense of dread that was impossible to shake. This was no longer merely a mystery. It was a battle for the soul of the Pendleton family. The mansion loomed ahead, its dark silhouette cutting against the stormy night sky. The wind howled, echoing through the desolate landscape as Holmes and Watson made their way through the narrow hallways. Each step seemed to carry them deeper into the heart of the mystery, and into danger. Holmes paused at a seemingly inconspicuous door, his gloved hand brushing against the worn wood. He nodded toward Watson, signaling that the time had come. The door creaked open, revealing a chamber shrouded in shadows. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and dust. And there, in the center of the room, stood the villain, an unassuming man with a cold, calculating gaze. "So, you've found me, Sherlock Holmes," the man said, his voice smooth and confident but laced with malice. "But it is too late. The artifact is already in my grasp. The curse is beyond your control now." Holmes stepped forward, his voice steady, yet tinged with the weight of revelation. "The artifact, yes, a tool of unimaginable power. But you have underestimated one thing, the very force you sought to control. The artifact does not choose its master. It corrupts, twists, and destroys. You may think you wield it, but in truth, it is the one wielding you." The man's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You think you can stop me? I have already set the wheels in motion. The Pendleton family is doomed." With a swift motion, Holmes seized the ancient artifact, holding it aloft. For a moment, the room seemed to tremble with energy, as if the very air itself fought against the power contained within the object. "No," Holmes declared, his voice unwavering. "I will not let you continue this madness." He smashed the artifact against the cold stone floor, the sound of shattering glass reverberating through the room. The villain, momentarily stunned, lunged forward, but Holmes was quicker, knocking him aside with a swift movement. As the man crumpled to the ground, it was clear. The curse had been broken, its hold on the Pendleton family shattered forever. The storm outside had subsided, and the mansion, once a place of dread and despair, now stood silent and still. Holmes and Watson stood in the now empty chamber, the remnants of the shattered artifact scattered across the floor. The weight of their victory hung heavily in the air. "The curse is lifted," Holmes said, his voice soft but resolute. The Pendleton family is free from the dark grip that has held them for generations. But at what cost? Watson, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow, nodded solemnly. Archibald. Archibald, Holmes repeated quietly. A pawn, consumed by forces he never truly understood. But there is solace in knowing that the truth has come to light. The Pendleton family's past has been exposed, and with it, their future can begin anew. They stood in silence for a moment longer, the finality of the situation settling in. The villain was taken into custody, and the family, though forever scarred by their dark history, would now have a chance to rebuild. As they left the mansion, Holmes glanced back one last time. The mansion was no longer a place of darkness, but rather a symbol of redemption, a testament to the power of truth. "Well, Watson," Holmes said, his voice returning to its usual sharpness, "another case closed." Watson smiled faintly, grateful for the peace that had finally been restored. The mansion, once alive with the whispers of its haunted past, now stood silent under the weight of its history. The door creaked as it opened, and Holmes, with his usual air of purpose, stepped inside, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous halls. Watson followed, glancing warily about as though expecting the shadows themselves to stir. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured, his voice cool but thoughtful. "The disturbances have ceased. Not a creak, not a murmur. The house, for all its former mystery, now feels like a hollow shell." Watson was less sure. "It feels empty, almost as if something is still waiting to be revealed." Holmes turned his piercing gaze toward his companion. "And yet, there is nothing. No more strange noises, no more signs of unnatural forces at play. The curse, as we suspected, was merely a figment, a product of a man's scheming mind." Watson nodded but remained quiet, uneasy. He had seen enough to doubt his own perceptions. "I suppose it is over now. The Pendleton family, the treasure, the curse, all vanished in the wake of the truth." Holmes glanced up at the grand staircase that once might have held the ghosts of its ancestors, now utterly still. The truth has a peculiar way of restoring order. What was once shrouded in legend now seems disappointingly mundane. As they walked deeper into the abandoned mansion, the chill of the place seemed to settle in, an uncomfortable reminder of the darkness that had lingered here. The treasure, the curse, all had been tied to something far more earthly than the supernatural. Holmes's deduction had finally brought them to this point, the end. The hollow, crumbling walls of the Pendleton mansion loomed on either side as Holmes and Watson ventured deeper into its forgotten corridors. The house, now deserted, had an air of finality about it, the silence almost suffocating. Holmes's voice broke the stillness, cool and detached as ever. "This was no work of the supernatural, Watson," he remarked, his words measured and precise. "The curse, if we are to call it that, was a fabrication, a series of deceptions carefully woven by a mind consumed by greed." Watson, his mind still reeling from the strange events they had witnessed, hesitated before speaking. "You are certain? We saw things that cannot be explained so easily. The whispers, the shadows, the very air in this place." Holmes turned to face him, his expression one of rare contemplation. "I do not deny that there were moments that seemed beyond reason. But consider this. Every event, every odd occurrence was part of a design. The symbols, the strange occurrences, the fear they instilled, these were all tools to manipulate the Pendleton family and keep them in line, to keep them searching for an elusive treasure." "But why go to such lengths?" Watson asked, his voice filled with doubt and intrigue. "For power, for control, for the unrelenting pursuit of a dream," Holmes said with a quiet intensity. "The treasure, though valuable, was but a symbol, a means to an end. The true aim was to perpetuate fear, to make the family believe they were cursed, and to manipulate them into a desperate hunt that ultimately led to their undoing. Watson shivered at the thought. And Archibald? Was he merely a pawn? Indeed, Holmes replied, his tone grim, a victim of his own ambition and fear. But it was the Pendleton legacy, a history stained by secrets that proved the true catalyst for tragedy. As they wandered further through the mansion, the air grew heavier with each step. The floorboards creaked beneath them, but the house seemed almost devoid of life now, a place of memory and loss. Watson's gaze lingered on the decaying portraits of long-dead Pendleton ancestors that lined the walls. The Pendleton family, Holmes mused, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space, is a tale of human folly and ambition. The treasure, which they thought would secure their future, was the very thing that doomed them. A family bound by a curse of their own making. Watson stopped before one such portrait, staring at the stern face of a man whose eyes seemed to follow him even now. Do you think any of them knew the price of their greed? The generations before who sought this treasure, who lived with the same obsession. I believe they were as trapped as Archibald, Holmes replied, each one believing that the treasure would offer them power, redemption, or salvation. But it only ever led them further into despair. It is a tragic irony. No treasure, no matter how valuable, could undo the damage done by their insatiable desire. But why did it fall to us, Holmes? Watson asked, his voice somber. To uncover the truth, to destroy the legacy that has haunted this place? Holmes paused, his sharp mind calculating. Because, Watson, we are not driven by the same desires that consumed the Pendletons. We seek truth, not power. As they continued walking, the quiet of the house seemed to settle around them, a final reminder of the consequences of human ambition. As they left the mansion, its oppressive atmosphere still clinging to their minds, Watson looked to Holmes for some form of explanation or reflection. What of the supernatural, Holmes? Watson asked. All the signs, the symbols, the ghosts that seem to haunt this place? Surely you must admit there was something beyond the ordinary. Holmes paused, his gaze far away as he considered his final thoughts on the matter. Supernatural? I've never been one to indulge in such notions, Watson. The truth, however unsettling, is far more satisfying. It was not a curse that haunted the Pendleton family, but their own desires. Watson looked at him, searching for some hidden doubt in his words. So, the entire mystery was a product of human obsession? Precisely, Holmes replied. The myths and legends that grew around this mansion were not born of the supernatural, but of the human need for something beyond the ordinary. The Pendletons created their own curse, and in doing so, they became the architects of their own downfall. There is a certain sadness in that, isn't there? Watson murmured, the weight of the situation pressing on him. There is, Holmes agreed, his voice soft but firm. But it is a reminder that desire, unchecked and unchallenged, can lead to the creation of myths, legends, and ultimately, ruin. With that, they turned their backs on the mansion, leaving its dark past behind them, and walked into the mist, knowing that another case had been solved, but not without leaving a trace of melancholy in its wake. Despite the case's resolution, a peculiar sense of disquiet still lingered with me, far beyond the soundless corridors of the Pendleton mansion. Sherlock, ever the skeptic, had dismissed the supernatural elements with his usual precision, but there was an unease that clung to the edges of my thoughts. The unsettling events we had witnessed, whispers in the dark, shadows where there should have been none, and a sense of being watched, left a mark on my soul. No explanation, no matter how deftly crafted by Holmes's razor-sharp mind, could erase the eerie sensation that had gnawed at my resolve. Holmes, of course, seemed unaffected. His manner was as impassive as ever, his attention turned to his habitual deductions, already unraveling the human flaws that had driven the Pendleton family to their downfall. Yet I could not help but feel that there was more to the mystery than his logic could explain. There were moments, fleeting though they were, when I swore that the mansion itself, Its walls, its floors, its air had its own pulse, its own memory of the events that had unfolded within it. "I cannot help but wonder," I remarked, my voice low, "if we have truly seen the last of these occurrences. Do you not feel that something remains, a shadow of the past?" Holmes's response came not in words, but in a glance, one that spoke volumes of his certainty that all was as it should be. Still, I could not shake the lingering doubt, the feeling that some part of the puzzle remained locked, hidden just out of reach. Holmes paused for a moment, his gaze fixed not on me, but on the mansion's distant silhouette, fading into the gloom of the evening. His voice, when it came, was calm, but held a trace of something deeper, something that suggested his thoughts had ventured far beyond the confines of this particular case. "Watson," he began, his tone reflective, "what we have witnessed here is but a reflection of the darker side of human nature: greed, obsession, and the desire for immortality. Legends are born not of truth, but of the fervent desires of those who would weave them into existence." I looked at him, bewildered. "You mean the curse was no more than a fabrication? That the strange happenings were merely the product of human manipulation?" "Precisely. But it is not the event itself that creates the myth. It is the desire to believe, to cling to something greater than ourselves. And that is where the danger lies." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he continued, his words heavy with an insight I had not expected. "In our pursuit of the extraordinary, we create our own demons, and in doing so, we allow them to haunt us." His words hung in the air, leaving me to ponder the deeper implications of what he had said. The case, once solved, now seemed to echo with a more profound mystery, a question of how easily the human heart could be swayed by its own desires. And so, with the mansion fading behind us, we made our way back to London, leaving the strange tale of the Pendleton curse to rest in the annals of history. Holmes's footsteps were steady, his mind already turned to the next case, while my own thoughts lingered on the enigma we had just unraveled. The mansion, though silent now, would forever remain in my memory, a reminder that even in the most logical of minds, there are shadows that linger, waiting to be cast by the light of our desires. With a final glance at the decaying structure, we stepped into the night, the mystery solved, but never truly understood.